The sky above the Yalu River held no mercy that morning. Captain Nikolai Volkov could feel it in his bones, in the thin air at 28,000 feet, in the way the frost gathered at the edges of his cockpit canopy like the fingers of winter herself, reaching for him. The cold was absolute up here, a physical presence that pressed against the plexiglass, that seeped through every seal and rivet despite the heating system laboring beneath his seat. He flexed his fingers inside his leather gloves, maintaining circulation, maintaining connection to the machine that kept him alive in this hostile realm where human beings were never meant to exist. The MiG-15 beneath him was a beautiful machine, all silver curves and Soviet engineering, elegant lines that spoke of speed and purpose and deadly efficiency. But today it wore the red star of North Korea painted hastily over its fuselage, covering the Soviet markings that were its true identity. A lie, written in crimson. He was not supposed to be here. None of them were. The world believed only Chinese and Korean pilots flew these silver jets above the frozen wasteland the Americans called MiG Alley. The world was carefully, deliberately, strategically wrong. And Volkov, like every man in his squadron, was complicit in that lie, was himself a ghost, a phantom, a man who officially did not exist in this place at this time. Below him, through breaks in the cloud, the Yalu River twisted like a scar across the landscape, marking the boundary between North Korea and China, between engagement and sanctuary, between life and the very real possibility of death. It was a line drawn by politicians and generals, invisible from this altitude except as a cartographic concept, but it was as real as any physical barrier. Cross it going north, and you were safe, untouchable, beyond the reach of American guns. Cross it going south, and you entered the killing ground, the free-fire zone, the place where young men in fast jets tried to murder each other with professional efficiency. On the American radio frequencies, he knew they called this corridor hell. Volkov had heard their transmissions, clipped and professional, laced with an edge of fear they tried to hide beneath their casual bravado and their cowboy slang. Good. Let them be afraid. Fear kept you sharp. Fear kept you alive. Fear was the body's way of saying, pay attention. This matters. One mistake here, and you will never see another sunrise. He had learned that lesson in the skies above Kursk, above Berlin, above the burning cities of the Third Reich. Fear was not weakness. Fear was wisdom written in the language of survival instincts, honed across millions of years of evolution. Volkov adjusted his oxygen mask, tasting rubber and cold air. His breath came out, invisible puffs, despite the heating system. It was December 1951, and winter had come to Korea with a brutality that surprised even him, a man who had survived 3 winters on the Eastern Front against the Germans. This was different. This cold was cleaner, sharper, like a blade drawn across exposed skin. And the war here was different too. No ground gained, no cities liberated. Just this endless dance in the sky, jets screaming past each other at speeds that would have seemed impossible just 5 years ago. His squadron was 4 ships strong today. To his left flew Major Boris Abakumov, a veteran who had flown Il-2 Sturmovix against panzers in the mud of Kursk. To his right, 2 younger pilots, Captain Sergei Kramarenko and Dmitry Oskin, men who had learned to fly in peacetime and were now writing their names in this secret war. They flew in finger 4 formation, the classic German pattern that the Americans had also adopted. Strange how war made everyone learn from everyone else, how the best tactics transcended flags and ideologies. The radio crackled, Abakumov's voice, calm and weathered like old leather. Falcon lead. I have contacts. Angels 2 to 5. Bearing 090. Range 20 kilometers. Volkov's eyes snapped to his gun sight, then to the vast emptiness ahead. His hands moved across the controls with practiced efficiency, checking fuel, checking ammunition, checking the engine gauges. Everything green. Everything ready. Copy. Falcon 2. All aircraft, prepare for engagement. Remember, we are invisible men. We were never here. It was the bitter truth they lived with. If he was shot down, if he was captured, Moscow would deny everything. He would become a non-person, erased from history. His family told he died in a training accident. The same fate awaited all of them. They were ghosts flying ghost planes in a war that officially did not involve them. The Americans knew, of course. Their intelligence was not blind. But proving it was another matter. And in the delicate dance of Cold War politics, deniability was everything. The contacts resolved into shapes against the pearl gray sky. 4 swept-wing fighters, unmistakable even at this distance. F-86 Sabres, the American jet that had changed everything, that had ended the MiG's brief period of absolute dominance. They were more or less equal now, these two machines. The MiG climbed faster, turned tighter at altitude. The Sabre had better controls at high speed, better gun sight, better training for most of its pilots. On any given day, the outcome was written in skill and luck, and the thousand small variables that separated life from death. At 600 miles per hour, Volkov felt his pulse quicken, felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came before combat. It was like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing you were about to jump. He pushed the throttle forward, and the MiG surged, the Klimov VK-1 engine responding with a deep, powerful roar that he felt through his seat. The acceleration pressed him back, gravity pulling at his cheeks, his lips. Around him, his squadron matched his movement, 4 silver arrows streaking toward the enemy. The Americans had seen them now. He watched their formation shift, splitting into 2 elements, gaining altitude. They knew the MiG's advantage at height, and they were trying to neutralize it. Good tactics. He would have done the same. The lead Sabre pilot was no fool. Volkov recognized the fluid way they moved, the discipline. These were not green pilots fresh from training. These were veterans, men who had survived months in MiG Alley, men who had learned its lessons in blood. Falcon 3, Falcon 4, take the northern pair. Falcon 2, with me on the southern element. His voice was steady, professional. Inside, his heart hammered. It always did. Anyone who said they felt no fear in combat was either lying or insane. The sky became geometry, angles and vectors and closing speeds. Range 15 kilometers, 12, 10. He could see the sunlight glinting off their canopies now, could imagine the American pilots checking their own instruments, saying their own prayers to their own gods. War made philosophers of them all. At 8 kilometers, the first Sabre opened fire. Tracers arced across the sky, brilliant orange streaks that looked deceptively lazy from this distance, but were actually traveling faster than sound. Supersonic messengers of death that could tear through aluminum and flesh with equal indifference. Too far. Desperation fire, or maybe just a warning. A statement of intent. A message sent across the void that said, I see you. I am here. I am not afraid. Volkov held his own trigger discipline, conserved his ammunition with the careful miserliness of a man who understood scarcity. The MiG carried only 90 rounds for its 37mm cannon and 80 for its 23mm guns. Every shot had to count. Every shell was precious. In the chaos of combat, with adrenaline flooding his system and his heart hammering against his ribs, he had to maintain that iron control, that careful calculation. It was the difference between the living and the dead, between the ace and the statistic, between going home and being listed as missing in action in a war that officially did not involve him. He pulled into a climbing spiral, using the MiG's superior thrust-to-weight ratio. The altimeter unwound rapidly. 29,000, 30,000, 31,000. The engine screamed, pushing against the thin air, gulping fuel. Behind him, he knew Abakumov would be mirroring his movement, maintaining mutual support. They had flown together for 6 months now. They knew each other's rhythms, each other's thoughts. In combat, that kind of synchronicity was worth more than any technical advantage. The Sabres climbed after them, but could not match their rate. Physics and engineering, the MiG reached for the sun, and the Americans fell behind, just slightly, just enough. Volkov, felt a grim satisfaction. He rolled inverted at the top of his climb, looking down through his canopy at the world below. The Sabres were there, 2,000 feet beneath him, their silver wings catching the light. Perfect. He pulled through, diving now, building speed, the earth rotating around him as he committed to the attack. The G-forces built, pressing him down into his seat, narrowing his vision. He forced breath into his lungs, tightened his core muscles, fought the grayness at the edges of his sight. The Sabre grew in his windscreen, filling his gun sight. Range closing, 1,200 meters, 1,000, 800. His finger found the trigger. The MiG shuddered as the cannons fired, the 37mm thumping like a heartbeat, the 23mm buzzing like angry wasps. The recoil slowed the plane, made it wallow in the air. He walked the tracers across the sky, leading the target, anticipating where the Sabre would be in the next half-second. The American pilot broke hard left, pulling vapor from his wingtips, visible evidence of the extreme forces acting on his aircraft. Good reaction. Fast, but not fast enough. Volkov saw his shells connect, saw the bright sparks of impacts on the Sabre's tail section. Not fatal, but damage. The American dove away, streaming a thin trail of smoke. His wingman was already moving to cover him, to deny Volkov a finishing shot. Professional. These men were professionals. Falcon lead, break right. Abakumov's voice, urgent. Volkov reacted before conscious thought, before his mind could process the warning. Training and instinct. He pulled hard into a right-hand brake, the G-forces crushing him, the world spinning. Tracers flashed past where he had been a second before. Another Sabre, one he had not seen, one that had been waiting for exactly this moment of target fixation. He cursed himself. Basic mistake. Never fixate. Never lose sight of the whole picture. The two aircraft merged, passing each other canopy to canopy at a combined speed of nearly 1,200 miles per hour. For one frozen instant, Volkov looked directly into the American cockpit, saw the other pilot's face behind his oxygen mask, saw the white scarf around his neck, saw human eyes meeting his own. Then they were past, separating. The moment gone. He pulled into a climbing turn, looking for position, looking for advantage. The furball had developed now 8 aircraft in a swirling, three-dimensional battle that sprawled across 5 miles of sky. Aircraft crossed and recrossed, merged and separated, each pilot fighting his own desperate calculus of angles and energy and opportunity. Below them, the Yalu River watched with ancient indifference. Volkov found himself alone for a moment, separated from the main fight by a series of defensive maneuvers. His breathing was harsh in his oxygen mask, his flight suit soaked with sweat despite the cold. He checked his fuel. Still adequate, but falling. The MiG drank fuel when pushed hard, and he had been pushing very hard indeed. Movement caught his eye. A single Sabre, low and to the north, apparently trying to disengage from the fight. Damaged, maybe, or just smart, knowing when to leave. Volkov made his decision in a heartbeat. He rolled inverted and pulled through, converting altitude to speed, diving after the American. The MiG accelerated with savage enthusiasm, the airspeed indicator spinning upward. 500 knots, 550, 600. The controls grew heavier, the stick wanting to stay centered, requiring real force to move. The Sabre saw him coming. Of course he did. No pilot worth his wings would be unaware of a MiG diving on him from above. The American began a series of jinking turns, never the same twice, trying to spoil Volkov's aim, trying to buy time until his friends could help him. But his friends were engaged themselves, locked in their own battles. He was alone. They both were. Volkov closed the distance with the single-minded focus of a predator. Range, 1,000 meters, 900, 800. He fired a short burst, more to force a reaction than with any expectation of hitting. The Sabre broke hard right, then reversed left, a scissors maneuver designed to force an overshoot. Clever. But Volkov had seen this before. He throttled back, extended his speed brakes, bled off excess velocity. The MiG's nose, tracked the Sabre through the turn, staying locked on. 700 meters. 650. 600. Close now. Very close. He could see the individual panels on the American's fuselage, could see the antennas and the pitot tube and the small imperfections in the paint. The Sabre filled his gun sight, the ranging reticle settling on the center of mass. His finger tightened on the trigger. And then the engine coughed. It was a small thing at first, a momentary hiccup in the otherwise steady roar of the Klimov VK, one that had been his faithful companion through 5 months of combat. A brief interruption in the mechanical symphony that kept him alive at 26,000 feet. Maybe a piece of debris in a fuel line, some microscopic fragment of metal or carbon that had broken free and lodged itself in a place it did not belong. Maybe a momentary fluctuation in pump pressure, some valve sticking, some seal wearing thin. Maybe just bad luck, the kind of random malfunction that could happen to any machine pushed to its limits day after day in temperatures that froze oil and cracked metal. But at 600 knots, at altitude, with an enemy aircraft filling his gun sight and every nerve in his body focused on that single perfect moment of firing, on that instant when trajectory and timing and probability all aligned, it might as well have been a catastrophic explosion. The universe had hiccuped, and everything had changed. The cough came again, louder this time, more pronounced. Volkov felt it through his seat, felt the airframe shudder slightly, felt the vibration change from smooth power to something irregular and wrong. The engine RPM dropped, just for a second, just enough. Maybe 200 RPM. On the gauge it looked like nothing, a tiny dip in a needle's arc, but the MiG noticed. The aircraft decelerated, not much, maybe 20 knots, but enough to throw off his aim, enough to ruin the perfect geometry of the shot, enough to turn certain victory into frustrating near miss. His carefully planned burst went low, the shells passing beneath the Sabre's belly by what must have been less than a meter, close enough that the American pilot surely felt them pass, surely saw the tracers flash by his canopy, surely understood how close he had come to dying. The Sabre, sensing his reprieve like a prisoner unexpectedly pardoned, broke even harder, the pilot pulling with everything he had, trading precious altitude for speed, diving for the deck where the MiG's advantage would evaporate in the thicker air and where Volkov's damaged engine would struggle even more. Volkov fought the stick, fought the suddenly sluggish controls as the engine coughed a third time. Warning lights flickered on his instrument panel. Engine temperature rising, oil pressure fluctuating. Not catastrophic, not yet, but wrong. Very wrong. He had seconds to make a decision. Continue the engagement with a sick engine, or break off. Preserve his aircraft. Preserve his life. The decision was made for him. The engine coughed again, harder this time, and the RPM drop was unmistakable. The MiG was dying beneath him, and he knew it. He pulled up and away, abandoning the pursuit, climbing for altitude while he still had power. Maybe it would recover. Maybe it was just a temporary fault. Maybe he would make it back to Antung airfield across the border in China. Falcon lead to all aircraft. I have engine problems. Breaking off engagement. Heading north. Abakumov's voice came back immediately, tense. Copy, Falcon lead. We are coming with you. Falcon 3, Falcon 4. Break and follow. Negative, Falcon 2. Complete the mission. I can make it alone. He hoped that was true. The Yalu was 15 kilometers away. Sanctuary. Safety. China, where the Americans could not follow, where he could nurse his dying aircraft down to a runway instead of into the frozen earth. The engine was running rough now, the vibration telegraphing through the airframe, making his teeth chatter, making the instruments blur. He throttled back, trying to ease the strain, but that meant losing altitude, losing the precious height that might mean the difference between a landing and a crash, the mathematics of disaster. He looked back over his shoulder, checking his 6. An automatic gesture born of 1,000 hours in the cockpit, a reflex so deeply ingrained that he did it without conscious thought, and that was when he saw it. A single Sabre, alone, climbing hard through the thin air, coming after him with single-minded determination, not the one he had been chasing, Not the damaged one fleeing for home. A different one. Fresh. Dangerous. And it was climbing impossibly fast. Too fast. Faster than any saber should be able to climb at this altitude, where the air was so thin that wings barely had anything to bite into. For a moment, Volkov thought he was hallucinating, that hypoxia had finally caught up with him despite his oxygen system, that stress and adrenaline had broken something fundamental in his perception of reality. He blinked hard, shook his head slightly, looked again. But no, the saber was real, solid, undeniable. And it was closing the distance with frightening speed, its pilot pushing the engine to maximum power, maybe beyond maximum power, burning fuel at a prodigious rate, but not caring because the target was right there, wounded and vulnerable. And this was the kind of opportunity that came once in a lifetime. The American had seen him, had recognized the smoke trail for what it was, had understood that the MiG was hurt and alone and far from home. And like any predator, he had committed to the chase with absolute conviction. He checked his instruments again. Altitude 24,000 feet and falling. Speed 400 knots and falling. Engine temperature in the red. He was a wounded animal, and the American had sensed it with the predatory instinct that all fighter pilots shared. This was not about orders or missions anymore. This was personal. This was one pilot seeing an opportunity and taking it, following him into the neutral zone, into the forbidden space, because sometimes the chance for a kill overrode everything else. Volkov felt something he had not felt since the darkest days of the war with Germany, since that terrible winter of 1942, when the Luftwaffe had ruled the skies, and every mission felt like a suicide run. True fear. Not the adrenaline rush of combat, not the sharp edge of alertness that came with engaging an enemy on equal terms, but cold, crawling, visceral dread that started in his gut and spread through his limbs like ice water in his veins. The kind of fear that made his hands want to shake, that made his breath come short and shallow, that made every second feel like an eternity and every heartbeat thunder in his ears. He was going to die here. Shot down by an American he could not outrun, could not outfight, could not escape. His engine had betrayed him at the worst possible moment, and now he was going to pay for it with his life. His wife would receive a telegram saying he had died in a training accident. His children would grow up without a father, wondering if he had been brave at the end, not knowing the truth of this secret war. The thought of them, of never seeing them again, of his daughter's 6th birthday party next month that he would miss, sent a spike of desperate determination through him. Not yet. He was not ready to die yet. There was too much left undone, too much unlived life waiting for him if he could just survive the next few minutes. The Yalu River was ahead, so close. 5 kilometers maybe, but it might as well have been 5,000. The saber was in firing range now. Volkov jinked desperately, pulling and pushing, making himself a difficult target, but the rough engine robbed him of energy with every maneuver. He was bleeding speed, bleeding altitude, bleeding hope. He heard the rattle of gunfire, felt the impacts, sharp staccato bangs as 50 caliber bullets punched through his wing. Not fatal, but more damage, more problems. The MiG was dying faster now. He could feel it in the controls, could feel the way the aircraft wanted to fall rather than fly. The radio crackled, cutting through his desperate thoughts like a knife. A voice speaking English, calm and professional, despite the circumstances, with an accent that might have been from the American South, from Georgia or Alabama, or one of those states Volkov knew only from maps. The words were measured, almost formal, carrying a weight that transcended the mere communication of information. MiG pilot, you are in Chinese airspace. I am breaking off engagement. Volkov blinked, his mind struggling to process what he had just heard. He looked down, forcing his eyes to focus past the sweat and the fear, past the warning lights and the smoke. The Yalu River was beneath him, its frozen surface catching the afternoon sun, the ice beginning to crack with the first hints of spring. When had he crossed it? How had he not noticed? He had been so focused on survival, on keeping the dying aircraft in the air, on watching the American close the distance, that he had lost track of his position. The boundary had passed beneath him, unmarked and unnoticed, but it was real nonetheless. Sanctuary. He had made it to sanctuary. The invisible line that separated war from something potentially worse, that kept this conflict limited and controlled, that prevented it from escalating into World War III. And the American, whoever he was, whatever hatred or frustration or ambition drove him, was honoring that invisible line, was choosing to respect the careful diplomatic fiction that kept the Cold War cold. He was turning away from a certain kill, from a victory that would add to his score and his reputation, because there were rules here, unwritten but real, more binding than any treaty, because they were enforced not by law but by conscience. He watched in his mirrors as the Sabre rolled away, diving back toward North Korea. The American waggled his wings once, a salute between warriors. Then he was gone, shrinking to a speck, and then to nothing. Volkov was alone in the sky with his wounded aircraft and his hammering heart. Antung Airfield appeared ahead through the haze, the runway visible even from this distance, a strip of concrete that represented hope and safety and the possibility of tomorrow. It looked impossibly small from up here, impossibly far away, though it was only 10 kilometers distant. He had perhaps 2 minutes of flight time left before the engine quit entirely, before the fire burned through something critical, before the whole aircraft became an uncontrollable coffin plummeting toward the earth. 2 minutes, 120 seconds. He ran through the emergency procedures in his mind, a litany he had practiced 100 times in training but never wanted to use in reality. A series of steps that might save his life, or might prove completely inadequate depending on variables he could not control. Gear down, flaps down. Maintain airspeed above 160 knots until absolutely necessary. Then bleed it off slowly, carefully, maintaining control authority until the last possible moment. If the engine quits, you are a glider, a very heavy, very expensive, very unforgiving glider that wanted nothing more than to fall out of the sky and take you with it. The MiG shuddered again, more violently this time, the whole airframe shaking like a dog trying to shed water. Black smoke began streaming from the engine cowling, thick and oily, and shot through with occasional flickers of orange that spoke of fire barely contained. Fire warning light illuminated on the instrument panel, its red glow stark and unambiguous. Not good. Very not good. But the runway was there, concrete and hope stretched out beneath him like a promise, like a prayer answered. He could make it. He had to make it. The alternative was unthinkable. He keyed his radio with fingers that felt clumsy and thick despite his gloves. Antung Tower. Falcon lead, declaring emergency. Engine fire. Coming in dead stick. The tower's response was immediate. Professional. Copy. Falcon lead. Runway is clear. Emergency equipment standing by. Wind 350 at 8 knots. The gear came down with a reassuring thunk. The flaps deployed, the MiG's nose dropping as the increased drag took hold. He was committed now. No power meant no go-around. One chance to get this right. He aimed for the numbers at the end of the runway, watching his approach angle, watching his airspeed, watching everything at once and nothing at all, letting instinct guide his hands. The ground rose up to meet him, faster than it should, the sensation of speed heightened by his lack of engine noise. Just the wind howling past the canopy, just the whistle of his own breath. The MiG's wheels kissed the concrete, a hard landing but a landing nonetheless. He stood on the brakes, the anti-skid system chattering as the wheels fought for traction. The aircraft slowed, finally rolling to a stop halfway down the runway, smoke still pouring from the engine. Volkov sat there for a long moment, not moving, just breathing, just existing, just feeling the solidity of the ground beneath him after that eternity of falling. His hands were shaking. He noticed this with distant, clinical interest, watching his fingers tremble against his thighs as if they belonged to someone else. Fear reaction, delayed by adrenaline and necessity, finally catching up with him now that the immediate crisis had passed. His legs felt weak, uncertain, as if the bones had turned to water. His heart was still racing, pounding against his ribs hard enough that he could feel it in his throat, in his temples, in his wrists. He tasted copper and realized he had bitten his lip at some point during the landing, drawn blood without noticing. The pain was distant, abstract, unimportant compared to the overwhelming realization that he was alive. He had survived. Against all probability, against all logic, he had made it back. The engine had failed, the American had pursued him, death had reached out its hand, and yet here he was, breathing, thinking, feeling, alive. He unstrapped with fingers that fumbled at the buckles, muscle memory competing with residual tremors. The quick release worked finally, the harness falling away, and he pushed himself up from the seat. His back ached from the G-forces, from the hours of tension. He popped the canopy, the mechanical system still working despite everything else that had failed, and cold air rushed in, wonderfully fresh, after the close confines of the cockpit, with its smell of sweat and fear and smoke. He climbed down from the cockpit carefully, one foot finding the step, then the other, moving with exaggerated care because his legs still did not feel entirely trustworthy. When his boots finally touched the concrete of the runway, solid and real and blessedly immobile, he had to resist the urge to kneel down and kiss it like some medieval knight returning from crusade. The fire trucks were already there, foam spraying across the engine, white clouds billowing and dissipating in the wind. Mechanics swarmed the aircraft like ants on a wounded beetle, assessing damage, muttering among themselves in that mixture of technical jargon and profanity that was universal among men who worked with machines. The MiG looked like a wounded bird, one wing holed by 50 caliber bullets, the aluminum skin punctured and torn, the engine blackened by fire and smoke, the tail section scored by bullet impacts that had come terrifyingly close to severing control cables. It was a miracle the aircraft had held together at all, a testament to Soviet engineering and perhaps to whatever gods watched over pilots who pushed their luck too far. The chief mechanic, a grizzled sergeant named Petrov, who had been maintaining aircraft since before Volkov learned to fly, walked around the MiG slowly, taking in every detail with the careful attention of a surgeon examining a patient. He reached out and touched one of the bullet holes, tracing its edges with a finger, then looked up at Volkov with an expression that mixed respect and exasperation. "You bring them back in pieces, Captain." Always in pieces. But there was no real anger in his voice. Petrov understood. They all understood. In war, coming back in pieces was infinitely preferable to not coming back at all. "Can you fix her?" Volkov asked, though he knew the answer. These men could fix anything. They worked miracles with limited parts, improvised tools, and stubborn determination. He had seen them rebuild engines using components scavenged from 3 different wrecks, seen them patch bullet holes with aluminum cut from fuel drums, seen them keep aircraft flying through conditions that would have grounded any other unit. Petrov grunted, still examining the damage. "We can fix her. Whether you'll want to fly her again, that's your decision. But yes, Captain, we can fix her." He paused, then added quietly, "You were lucky today. The fuel line crack was small. Another few minutes, and it would have ruptured completely. You would have had no warning, just fire and explosion. The angels were watching you." A jeep approached, kicking up dust. Major Abakumov climbed out, his face grim beneath his flight helmet. He walked over, stopped in front of Volkov, looked him up and down. Then, without a word, he pulled out a cigarette case, offered one. Volkov took it with trembling fingers. They smoked in silence, watching the mechanics work. Finally, Abakumov spoke. The engine coughed, in the middle of a loop. Perfect shot, perfect position. Then the engine coughed. And the American followed me across the border, had me dead to rights, then broke off when I crossed the Yalu. Abakumov nodded slowly. "You owe that pilot your life." "I know." They stood there, 2 men in a war that did not officially exist, smoking cigarettes and thinking about the impossible margins between life and death. The other aircraft in the squadron were landing now, one by one, taxiing back to their revetments. Another mission complete. Another day survived. That night, in the small officers' quarters at Antung, Volkov could not sleep. He lay on his narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling where water stains made abstract patterns in the dim light from the hallway, replaying every moment of the engagement in his mind, with the obsessive attention to detail that combat pilots applied to their near-death experiences. The engine cough, the loss of the shot that should have been his, the desperate run for the border with the American closing behind him like fate itself, and that voice on the radio, calm and professional, making the choice to let him live. Each moment played out in his memory with crystal clarity, more vivid now than it had been in the actual experience, when everything had happened too fast for conscious thought and he had operated on pure instinct and training. He thought about his wife, Katya, back in Moscow, with their 2 children. She did not know where he was. Not really. The letters he sent her were censored, vague, carefully scrubbed of anything that might hint at his true location or mission. She knew only that he was flying somewhere dangerous, that he might not come home, that every day he survived was a small miracle. He pictured her face, the way her dark eyes crinkled when she smiled, the way she had looked at him the day he left, trying to be brave, trying not to cry in front of the children. Their daughter, Anya, was 5 years old, bright and curious, and completely unaware that her father was fighting in a war that officially did not exist. Their son, Mikhail, was only 2, still a baby really, and would he even remember his father if Volkov did not come home? The thought was like a knife in his chest, sharp and cold and unbearable. He thought about that moment when the Sabres' guns had rattled, when the bullets had punched through his wing. The American could have killed him, should have killed him, but he had not. He had honored the invisible line, the unspoken rules of this strange, limited war. Volkov wondered what the American pilot was doing right now, probably in his own quarters at some airbase in South Korea, having his own sleepless night, replaying his own decisions. Did he regret breaking off? Did he lie awake thinking about the kill that got away? Or did he sleep soundly, content with his choice to respect the boundary, to not escalate, to let one Soviet pilot go home to whatever home looked like in this life? In the morning, the maintenance report would come in. The engine failure had been caused by a cracked fuel line, a tiny hairline fracture that had chosen the worst possible moment to manifest. It could have happened to anyone. It was not Volkov's fault, but he would carry it with him anyway, the memory of that cough, that hiccup, that tiny moment that had changed everything. 3 weeks later, sitting in the briefing room at Antung, Volkov listened to the intelligence officer describe recent American tactics with the detached professional interest of a man who knew his life might depend on understanding these patterns. The room was cold, despite the small stove in the corner, and the assembled pilots sat on rough wooden benches, smoking cigarettes and drinking tea from metal cups, their breath visible in the morning air. Outside, dawn was breaking over the airfield, painting the MiGs in their revetments with pale gold light. Another day, another briefing, another chance to die or survive. The intelligence officer, a young lieutenant who looked like he should still be in university rather than analyzing combat reports, pointed to a series of photographs pinned to the wall. Gun camera footage, grainy and distant, showing various engagement angles and tactics. A new pilot had been making a name for himself in MiG Alley, he explained, a captain from the United States Air Force who flew with unusual aggression, who pushed deeper into the border zone than most, who had claimed 2 MiG kills in the last month and damaged 3 others. The Americans were calling him something, the intelligence officer continued, consulting his notes. They had a nickname for him, the White Scarf, because he always wore one, visible in every photograph, every gun camera image. It was becoming his signature, his calling card. The intelligence officer showed another photograph, this one clearer than most, taken from gun camera footage during a recent engagement. A pilot in an F-86 cockpit, his face partially obscured by his oxygen mask, but the white scarf clearly visible around his neck, stark against the dark fabric of his flight suit. Something about the angle, about the way the pilot sat in his cockpit, about the tilt of his head, sent a jolt of recognition through Volkov's chest. Volkov stared at the photograph for a long time. He could not be certain. It had been only one frozen instant, one moment of eye contact at 1,200 miles per hour. But something in his gut told him this was the same pilot, the one who had followed him across the Yalu, the one who had let him go. He wondered if they would meet again. The sky above MiG Alley was large, but their world was small. In time, their paths would likely cross. And when they did, what would happen? Would the American remember that day? Would Volkov be able to return the favor, to honor the same invisible line? The war ground on. December became January. January became February. The battles continued, the dance of MiGs and Sabres playing out at altitude day after day. A war within a war. A secret contest of men and machines that the world watched with half-closed eyes and strategic ambiguity. Pilots died. Some were buried with honor. Others simply vanished, their fates unknown, their families left to wonder. Volkov flew 43 more missions that winter. He shot down one Sabre, probably destroyed another, and damaged 3 more. He was himself shot at 17 times, hit twice, and forced to land with battle damage on 4 occasions. The MiG that had failed him that day in December was repaired and returned to service, though he refused to fly it again. Superstition, maybe, or just common sense. In April, as the Korean winter began its reluctant retreat and the ice on the Yalu started to crack, Volkov received orders. He was being rotated home to the Soviet Union, his tour complete. He had survived 5 months in MiG Alley, longer than most, longer than he had any right to expect. He was one of the lucky ones. On his last night in China, Abakumov threw together a small gathering. Vodka appeared from somewhere, as it always did when Russian pilots were involved. They toasted the fallen, they toasted the living. They toasted the MiG and the men who maintained it, and they toasted the Americans, their enemies and their counterparts, the only people in the world who truly understood what it meant to fight this war in the sky. Drunk and maudlin, Volkov found himself telling the story of that day in December, of the engine cough, and the impossible pursuit, and the American who had honored the boundary. His fellow pilots listened in silence, understanding in their eyes. They all had stories like that. Close calls, narrow escapes. Moments when the difference between life and death had come down to luck or mercy, or the mysterious grace that sometimes descends in the midst of chaos. "Do you think you will see him again?" asked Kramarenko, the young pilot who had learned so much in these frozen months. Volkov considered the question. Perhaps, or perhaps not. The world is large, and life is long. But that was a lie, and they all knew it. The world was not large. The world was this valley, this river, this narrow slice of sky, where men in jets played out the larger tensions of an age. And life was not long. Life was as fragile as a fuel line, as uncertain as an engine on a cold morning, as brief as the span between one heartbeat and the next. He flew out of Antung the following day, a passenger in a transport plane, watching the airfield shrink beneath him. The MiGs were lined up in their revetments, silver and red and deadly. Somewhere down there, American Sabres would be taking off for another mission, another day in MiG Alley. And somewhere, perhaps, the pilot with the white scarf would be strapping into his cockpit, running his pre-flight checks, preparing to dance once more along the invisible line that separated war from something worse. Volkov never learned the American's name. In the careful diplomacy of the Cold War, the two sides maintained their fictions, their deniability, their gentlemen's agreements. The Americans knew that Soviet pilots flew the MiGs. The Soviets knew that the Americans knew. But no one said it out loud, and no one pushed too hard, and the war stayed limited, stayed controlled, stayed just barely this side of catastrophe. Years later, retired and living in Moscow, teaching young pilots the lessons he had learned in the skies above Korea. Volkov would sometimes find himself thinking about that day. The engine cough, the impossible pursuit, the American who could have killed him but chose not to. He wondered if the other pilot ever thought about it, if he remembered that moment of decision, that choice to honor an invisible line. In his lectures, Volkov would tell his students that combat was about many things: skill and courage and tactics and technology. But it was also about judgment, about knowing when to press and when to hold back, about understanding that there were rules even in war, boundaries even in chaos. The students would nod, but he could see in their eyes that they did not truly understand. How could they? They had never felt an engine cough at the worst possible moment. They had never been hunted across a frozen river by an enemy who became, for one brief moment, something more complicated than an enemy. On the American side, in a small town in Georgia, a retired Air Force colonel named James Turner would sometimes tell a similar story about a day in December 1951, about a MiG with engine trouble, about a pursuit that ended at an invisible line. His grandchildren would listen, wide-eyed, asking why he had let the enemy pilot go, why he had broken off when he had the advantage. And Turner would smile and say that sometimes the most important victories were the ones you chose not to take, that sometimes the bravest thing a man could do was to turn away from a kill, to honor a boundary, to remember that even in war, even at 600 knots and 26,000 feet, there were rules that mattered more than any individual triumph. The two men never met, never spoke, never learned each other's names. But they were connected nonetheless, bound by that moment in the sky above the Yalu River, by the engine cough that had triggered an impossible pursuit, by the choice that one man made to let another man live. The war in Korea ended in July 1953. An armistice, not a peace. A frozen conflict that would last for decades. The pilots who had fought in MiG alleys scattered to the winds, returning to their countries, their families, their lives. Some stayed in the service, some left. Some carried wounds visible and invisible. All carried memories. The sky above the Yalu River returned to silence, or something like it. Commercial aircraft would occasionally transit the area, their passengers, unaware of the battles that had been fought there, of the men who had died there, of the complicated dance of honor and violence that had played out in that thin blue space between Earth and stars. But on certain days, when the light was right and the air was cold, if you looked up from the riverbank, you might almost imagine you could see them still. Silver aircraft wheeling and turning, leaving contrails that wrote stories in a language only pilots could read. Stories of courage and fear, of skill and luck, of the 1,000 tiny moments that separated life from death. And stories, too, of the invisible lines that men chose to honor even when no one was watching, even when the stakes were highest, even when everything within them screamed to press on, to finish, to win. Because in the end, that was what the engine cough had taught them both. Volkov and Turner, the Russian and the American, the men who had come so close to killing each other and who had instead found a different ending. It had taught them that the margins were thin, that control was an illusion, that at any moment the universe could cough and change everything. And it had taught them that in those moments, the choices you made defined not just the outcome of a single engagement, but the kind of man you were, the kind of world you were willing to live in. The MiG's engine had coughed mid-loop, triggering a perfect intercept that should have been impossible. But the impossible had happened. The Soviet pilot had survived, the American pilot had turned away. And somewhere in that intersection of chance and choice, of malfunction and mercy, something had been preserved that was more important than any kill statistic, any combat report, any medal or commendation. Humanity. In the midst of mechanized slaughter, in the age of jet engines and nuclear weapons, in a war fought by men who were not supposed to be there, humanity had flickered to life for just a moment, and that moment had been enough. The sky remembers. The Yalu River remembers. And in the hearts of two old men, on opposite sides of the world, in different languages and different contexts, the same memory lives. A memory of a day when an engine coughed, when an impossible pursuit began, when a choice was made that no one ordered, no one expected, no one would ever fully understand except the two men who lived it. That is the story. That is the truth. Not the simplified version in the history books, not the propaganda on either side, but the human truth, complicated and contradictory and real. A Soviet engine coughed mid-loop. It triggered a perfect American intercept that should not have been possible. And in the end, both men flew home, carrying the weight of that moment for the rest of their lives, bound together by the invisible threads that connect all who have looked into the face of death and chosen, against all logic, to embrace life instead.